We continue in Devarim, Perek Yud Zayin, 17th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy. Lo tizbach la'Adonai Elohecha shor vaseh asher yiyeh vomum kol davara ki toavat Adonai Elohecha hu. You shall not sacrifice to God an ox or a sheep, because this is abhorrent to God if it has a defect, right? It doesn't have to be, you don't have to give necessarily the most expensive object that you have, but what you have to give is something that is without mum, that is without blemish, which may in many ways be also about sort of the attitude. You have to approach things without blemish. You have to try to be pure in your soul, and that's represented by the sacrifice that you're given, which is pure. Pasuk bet, ki matzei v'chirbecha b'chad sharech asher Adonai Elohecha noten lach isho isha asher yaseh hara b'einei Adonai Elohecha la'avor brito. If found in your settlements is a man or a woman who has gone against the covenant, the Brit, one of the themes of the book of Devarim, the idea of the Brit, the covenant between God and the Jewish people, Vayelech, and that person goes, Vayavod Elohim acherim vayishtachu lahem, and he goes and he bows down, he worships a foreign idol, or the sun or the moon, or any of the stars or other things in the sky, and you're told about it, and you inquire. This can't just be mob justice. There has to at least be a drisha, there has to at least be a looking into it. And they find out that it's true, that this horrific thing was done in Israel. Then you have to take this man or woman out to the gates and the death penalty ensues. Important to point out here, there are many places in Sefer Devarim where we talk about the death penalty, and the Gemara describes how it was something that was more limited than the way it seems here in the Torah. There are all these cases, but the rabbis would really go through it, and there's a debate in the Gemara, in the Mishnah, and the Gemara as to whether or not this ever happened, whether there was death penalty. Certainly we know at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu there was, but whether or not the rabbis later on carried it out or not. Continuing verse 6. You need to have at least two witnesses, if not three. You cannot rely on one witness. The person could be incorrect. The person could be have some vendetta against the person who is against the accused. So you need to have more than one witness. And to demonstrate that the witnesses have to be certain. This is not, there's no job of the executioner here. The witness has to be the first one ready to give the death penalty, the first one to throw a stone, to demonstrate that 100% they know that this person went against the covenant, worshipped other gods, perhaps tried to get other people to do it as well. Let's focus on something else. Starting in verse 8. Right, so we start in the last yesterday's chapter, Parshat Shoftim. There are going to be judges and officers in all of your gates. But let's say there's a case that's too hard for you. So what do? You have to go up to the place that God will show you. Eventually it's going to be Jerusalem. We know the Sanhedrin, the high court of the Jewish people, is going to sit in Jerusalem. We're not told the place, but you have to go up to there, to the place that God will choose. You'll come to the priests and the Levites and the judge in those days, and they will investigate the case, and they will tell you what needs to be done. It's like this, it's like that. It was a complex case, but you're going to the people who know best, the Supreme Court. And you should carry out the verdict that is told to you. You have to scrupulously observe it. Everything that they told you, you cannot go against. You have to do kechol asher yorucha, exactly what it was that they told you to do. Al pi Torah asher yorucha, according to the Torah, that the instruction is given. You have to follow their instructions. You cannot deviate to the right. You cannot deviate to the left. You have to follow exactly what they tell you. And there's a mitzvah that's derived from this verse of lo tasur, that what the chachamim, what the rabbis, what the scholars tell you, you have to follow. You cannot go and do your own thing. You have to listen to their listen to their ruling. God gave the Torah. The written Torah is written down. The oral Torah is given to the leaders of the Jewish people to go and to further Jewish law over time. And there's this idea of lo tasur, of not deviating from that which they tell us. There are commentaries who say, it says yaminu small, right or left. Even if they tell you that your right is left and your left is right, you have to follow them. There are commentaries that go that far, that halacha does not necessarily have to follow reality. It could be following something that's not reality. How that works, that's beyond the scope of our study today. Continuing in verse 12, should either party dispute so if somebody goes in here and they argue and they disregard what the high priest or what the judge has said, then that person incurs the death penalty, because that person is messing with the entire judicial and legal system. And all people will be afraid and will not act in this presumptuous manner. We have to be very careful to protect our systems, our legal systems, the way that our government, our country works, is what we're told. Now we're going to go to something else. Mentioned yesterday that the Parshat Shoftim, these 16, 17, 18, 19, these chapters into the book of Deuteronomy, have many different leadership roles. And now we're being introduced to one of the very important leadership roles, which we will discuss a lot in the coming books, maybe not so much in the book of Yoshua, in some ways in the book of Shoftim, and then certainly in the book of Shmuel, the book of Malachim, and then in the further prophets as well. So right, Moshe tells them again, you're going to go into the land of Israel, you're going to take over the land, and you're going to say, when you are settled in the land, we want a king like all of the nations that surround us. We know that generally in the Torah, God says to Jewish people, you shouldn't do what the nations around you want to do. Don't do what they ask you to do. But here in this instance, you shall surely set a king above you, a king that God chooses. So interesting, the same language with the king is the language that's used for the place that will be holy. And we know that eventually, right, King David is going to be the chosen king of God. He's going to make his capital Jerusalem. So it's not so surprising that that language is the same, because their two are going to be, of course, inextricably linked. He cannot be a foreigner. It has to be a member of our community chosen by God. However, we know that the king is going to have great power, and we need to be very careful in the way in which the king operates. And therefore, lo yarbelo susim, lo yashivatam mitzrayim leman harbotzus v'adonai mar lachem lo tosifun lashub baderech hazeot. Firstly, he can't have too many horses. There's the understanding here in the Torah, he's going to have more horses than the average person. The average person has 10 horses, he's going to have 500 horses. But maybe he can't have 5,000 horses. He can't have too many, lest he goes down to Egypt, a place where there were horses, to get more horses. And God says you're not allowed to go back down to Egypt. Going back to Egypt is moving the wrong way. We came out of Egypt. Egypt was the place of slavery. We want to have freedom. Having a king is not supposed to enslave you once again, which is the way it can be interpreted, having a king. That's not what it's supposed to be. So he cannot bring the Jewish people back to Egypt. So number one, can't have too many horses. Number two, v'lo yarbelo noshim v'lo yasur levavo v'chesev v'zahav lo yarbelamo. Again, we know he's going to have more wives than the average person, but he can't have too many wives. Rabbis understand the Jew at the biblical period could have 4. The king could have up to 18. Right today, we know Ashkenazi can only have 1. Don't ask me how Shlomo HaMelech had 1,000, 300 regular, 700 concubines. That seems to be part of what causes his downfall. Again, he's going to be wealthier than everybody else, but he can't have too much money. So, right, again, we understand he's going to have more, he's going to take more, but there need to be some sort of restrictions that it doesn't go too far. And when he's sitting on his throne, so he has to have a copy of the teaching of the book of what's understood generally as the book of Devarim, this Mishnah Torah, have it a scroll along with the Kohanim and the Levium, meaning it's going to be easy for the king who has so much power. He needs to have the Torah, needs to be reminded of it, that it's there for him. And it should be with him. And we have to read it to him all the days of his life. He needs an extra reminder lest he forgets the Torah. It's always hard. You're in a position of authority. You're the king. You think you know better. You can do whatever you want. So in addition to maybe the regular signs that a Jew has in order to try to keep the mitzvot, things like tefillin and the tzitzit, the things that should remind you of God, the Kohen, the king needs a Torah. It needs to be close to him. It needs to be with him at all times, lest he goes. And the next pasuk describes that: Levilti rum levavo me'achav levilti sur min hamitzvah yaminu shmo. Lest he gets haughty, lest he gets arrogant. He thinks he's so great, and the mitzvos don't apply to him. And he says, the prophet said this, and the high priest said that, but I'm the king. I'm the be all and end all. I'm the Alpha and Omega. I'm going to do whatever I want. No. We have to keep him in check. We'll allow him to have more wives. We'll allow him to have more money. We'll allow him to have more horses. But there are limitations. He can't lead the people back to Egypt. He can't have too much, and the Torah needs to be there in order to keep him in check. So that he and his descendants will reign long in the midst of Israel. And one of the most discussed, obviously, mitzvot in the Torah, the mitzvah of the king, it becomes very important. Kings become, right, to maybe amongst the most famous Jews of all time. King David HaMelech, has a whole dynasty after him, even through the Second Temple period. The leader of the Jewish community, political leader, is Zerubbabel, who's direct descendant of David. Later on, the Nisiim during the Talmudic period are descendants probably through their mother, but from Hillel on are descendants from King David. So kings are really important. There's an interesting debate between the Abarbanel and the Rambam, two great medieval figures, about whether this is really a mitzvah or not. The Rambam's very pro-king. The Rambam talks about Melech HaMashiach. He talks about the Mashiach, the Messiah, may come speedily in our days, is the messianic king. He looks at a king and he sees it as a great idea. As opposed to the Abarbanel is very negative on kings. He looks here and he says, this is not what you should be doing. This is one of these places where the Torah is giving in to the concessions of man, like in other areas. God doesn't really want a king, but God will allow you to have a king when you say we want to be like the other nations. So God's worried you want to be like the other nations, so you're going to go get a non-Jewish king, go get a Gentile king. So the Abarbanel says, no. You shouldn't have a king, but God will allow you to have it. It's interesting to think about it from a historical perspective. The Rambam lived with a great king named Saladin. He was his doctor, or one of his many doctors, very close with this king. And perhaps the Rambam, from seeing Saladin, much like the Talmud talks about, when you see a Gentile king, will let you appreciate the greatness of a Jewish king. The Rambam is very, very pro-king, and maybe it comes from his relationship with this great historical figure, Saladin, as opposed to the Abarbanel, who lives in Spain and later in Portugal, who is the treasurer of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella at the time of the expulsion, who was offered, the king and queen offer him, because he was so great with the money, that he could stay there. And of course he leaves, he moves to Spain. He moves from Spain to Portugal for a number of years. He's then the treasurer for the king of Portugal. And I believe in 1497, the king of Portugal it expels all the Jews. And so the Abarbanel, a very negative association with kings. And when he looks at the king of the Torah, I would imagine that his mind was clouded by seeing these terrible kings and the terrible things that they did. And thus he is much more negative on this idea of kings. And so we will get to the fact, we'll get to later on, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it God just giving in? It's one of the great debates that's discussed by the Abarbanel and the Rambam. It's one of the great debates that we will see when we get to the book of Shmuel and his response when the Jewish people ask for a king. Is it something that God wants? Is it a rejection of God? Or is it something that the Jewish people they're trying to do because it says in the Torah that you shall have a king? We will come back to it, not today, not tomorrow, but in many months' time.